Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lysandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. Hello, my lovely. I hope you are doing well. Welcome to another episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. And today I'm going to be talking about the difference between codependency and being an empath. Now, make sure you stick around until the end, because at the end, I'm also going to be sharing with you some journal prompts that you can use. And so make sure you have some paper and pen or your journal to hand, because we are going to have some gentle reflective points that basically just follow up after this episode. And it will definitely help you if you are somebody who is an overthinker and you just like to have a space to be able to process your thoughts and process your emotions. And I always recommend journaling to many of my clients because it's so therapeutic and it really does help you to untangle some of the thoughts that you might have, because our brains can be very, very busy. And in order to sometimes slow that down, being able to journal can really help that. In fact, I have recorded a whole episode on journaling, if I'm correct. I'm sure I recorded a whole episode on it. I most definitely did. I will link that in the show notes so you can go back and listen to, because off the top of my head, I cannot remember what number episode it is, but it is something that I have definitely talked about in quite a lot of detail. So make sure you go and listen to that episode if you are curious about journaling or you want to learn more about how you can use that as part of your emotional well-being and healing. And just a quick intro, just so you know that I am not someone who has just read a bunch of self-help books. I am actually somebody who works in this field. I am a psychotherapist, and I have been a psychotherapist for over 10 years. And I work a lot with relational trauma, attachment, and things that stem from childhood trauma. Now, I personally hear a lot of the time people mix up the difference between being an empath and being codependent. And so I'm really going to clarify that today. So by the end of this episode, you are going to learn exactly what the difference is between the two and how you might be showing up as more codependent in your relationships as opposed to more empathic. And this really matters if you've experienced childhood trauma, because you might see yourself as somebody who is an empath, but actually what you're getting involved in are a lot of codependent behaviors. And that can really keep you stuck in really negative relationship patterns and hurtful relationship patterns. It can sometimes be hurtful and painful towards you because you are perhaps overgiving in your relationships, or your relationships can feel very one-sided, or that you put so much effort into being there for people and kind of taking on and trying to support, and maybe sometimes even overstepping that mark because you want to show your usefulness in relationships. And sometimes as a result of trying to show that you are useful, you like the feel of being needed, and that's not always the best thing in your relationships. But I also have to say, labels are not always very useful. And so although I am using the term empath, it's almost like a shorthand for me kind of talking about empathic qualities. It's not labeling you as, if you have this title, then I don't know, it's some kind of like personality quiz of this is you and this kind of defines you. As a therapist, it is more than just about understanding the labels. It's also understanding like the relational aspect of what something might mean for you, and some terms might resonate with you, but that also doesn't mean that you have to kind of just define yourself as that one thing, because we are way more nuanced and way more complex than that. So I don't want you to walk away from this episode labeling yourself as, oh, I'm an empath, or oh, I'm codependent. So I kind of just need to kind of throw that disclaimer in there, because I don't want you to be misinformed or to label yourself as things that, quite frankly, just isn't very helpful. So when you are an empath, you tend to feel emotions and feelings very deeply. Not only your own emotions, but you can also deeply feel the emotions of other people. So if somebody else is upset or crying or very emotional, you can almost take on that feeling as well. You can really, really empathize with them and really understand where they are coming from. And if you consider yourself as a nice person, you might think of it as, well, that's just a given, right? If somebody else is upset, of course I can feel their emotions, or of course I can empathize with them. And it's actually more difficult said than done. A lot of people think they are a lot more empathic than what they actually are. And that's where it comes into actual codependency. Instead of being able to actually empathize with someone's emotions, when you are more codependent, you feel someone else's feelings for them. So you don't recognize the difference between that's your feelings, that's your hurt, and I can empathize with you on that, I can sympathize with you on that, but I'm not going to take that on as my own. It's not going to make me feel so low that I can't function. So we're not going to both be sitting there in floods of tears, and in the end, the person who's actually upset ends up having to console you because you're feeling their feelings for them so deeply, and it's almost a little bit over the top and maybe a little bit out of place. So when you are an empath, you are someone who feels things very deeply for other people, but when you have more codependent traits, you end up feeling those feelings for them rather than just empathizing with them. And when you're an empath, you are able to allow other people to really feel their feelings. You're able to hold space for whatever they might be experiencing without necessarily trying to fix it or resolve it. Holding space is, and I think this was made very popular by, who is it? Ariana Grande, and who's the other actress? They did Wicked. Cynthia Enviro, I hope I'm saying that correctly. But it was all a bit pretentious, and also very funny when they were talking about holding space. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, this is going to make absolutely no sense to you. But if you know, then you know. Essentially, it's just being like a safe person for somebody to actually share their emotions with. And people who are not necessarily good at being empathic tend to feel very uncomfortable when people express their feelings or emotions, or they jump in and say, actually, this is what happened to me, and yeah, I totally relate because this happened to so and so, and then they kind of go on their own tangent and they kind of make someone else's pain about them, and maybe that's their way of trying to empathize, but that really isn't the definition of actually being able to hold space for someone. Being able to hold space for someone makes it safe enough for them to actually share their feelings and experiences with you, while you're actually also able to be really connected with them in that moment. So when you are more empathic, you're able to sit in that space of, even if it's uncomfortable, even if they are emotional, even if they are really angry or sad, or they're frustrated, or there's just really big, intense emotions that they're feeling, you can actually be a supportive space for them while they're doing that, without trying to jump in with a Me Too story, or without trying to almost fix it for them or to problem solve and make it go away. Because sometimes that's taking the autonomy away from someone. And sometimes, although you're trying to come from a place of being helpful, if that's not actually what the person needs, it actually isn't very helpful at all in that moment. And so when you are more codependent, you can actually be uncomfortable with sitting with that discomfort of not being able to fix things. You can really be uncomfortable with not having a solution, and perhaps even get frustrated with them if it's not something that you can actually resolve or help them with. And you can end up sometimes either minimizing what they're experiencing, or just coming from a place of not really being attuned to what they're actually trying to share with you, not really understanding how they're feeling, because you're more focused on, okay, how can I be of use in this situation? And that can be because you're used to having to almost prove your worth in relationships, almost trying to prove that by you being helpful, perhaps people will want to have you around more. And sometimes that can come from some anxious patterning and perhaps some childhood patterns that you might have picked up in wanting to be a people pleaser in terms of your parents, and trying to have that acceptance and validation from your parents or your adult figures in your life in your childhood. And then when you are an empath, and I think this has to be probably maybe the biggest one, possibly, but when you are more of an empath, you can actually set boundaries with people without feeling guilty, and you can set limits and still be a really good, kind, thoughtful, nurturing, empathic person, because you understand why boundaries are important, and you've been either actively working on it, or you've seen how boundaries look in practice based off of your childhood experiences. And so when people have experienced trauma and there hasn't been very many boundaries growing up within their family home, or they haven't had a healthy example of what setting boundaries actually looks like and being able to do that without fearing the consequences, then obviously it makes it so much easier in your adult relationships to be able to set those boundaries. But when you are more codependent, you actually struggle to not only set those limits, but even to see what those limits are. You might not even see them in the moment, or you might see it when it's too late. And something that you can really struggle with in terms of setting boundaries is the guilt. The guilt of sometimes putting yourself first, or the guilt of not being able to show up for people in every scenario, or just the guilt of perhaps even just saying no. Empaths tend to be driven a lot more by self-love and also self-awareness. So their motivation in relationships tend to be very different, because it's not about self-abandoning their needs, or it's not about coming from a place of uncertainty. It's actually coming from a place of being very open and curious about their relationships. And this is a trait that many people who have more of a secure attachment style can really relate to. And I'll probably try and also link maybe one, or I think maybe two other episodes I've talked about what it looks like when you have secure attachment and how that shows up in your relationships. But it's also very closely attuned with having very strong empathic qualities, because when you are driven by self-love in relationships, you are coming from a place of love without conditions. Because when you have codependency, you are often driven by fear, maybe a fear of abandonment, a fear of rejection, a fear of not being good enough, coming from a place of worrying and thinking about worst possible case scenarios. And sometimes you can actually project a lot of those feelings in relationships. So you can project that feeling of insecurity, that feeling of uncertainty. And usually people who have less fear around relationships can actually show up in relationships a lot more wholeheartedly, with more vulnerability, and they don't really fear about having the difficult conversations. They don't really fear intimacy. They don't overthink the relationship. They don't overthink people's motives or assume the worst out of people. And that can really be something that, if you are more insecure and you have more codependent patterns of behaviors in relationships, that can be where your brain and your nervous system tends to go. Okay, so I'm very aware that I've kind of interweaved those two concepts together. So I've kind of talked about what it looks like to be an empath, and then what it looks like to be codependent. And maybe your brain works a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to recap what it looks like more so when you're an empath first, and then I will define what it looks like when you're codependent, just so that you've got a really clear understanding of separating the two, especially because you don't really have a visual for this. And sometimes just having clarity always is useful, right? So when you are an empath, you are going to be naturally more attuned to the emotions of others. So you're going to be very aware of someone's shift in mood, or very aware of if somebody is in an emotional state, or if they're experiencing feelings of sadness, or whatever that feeling or emotion might be. You're quite good at being able to pick up if they're dealing with something that feels quite heavy and it's weighing on them. You tend to be really highly sensitive and attuned to people's moods and energy. So if there is an altercation in a room and it's happened before you've arrived and then you've walked into the room, sometimes you can just feel the tension. You can kind of feel the shift in energy. But if you kind of notice that shift and it comes up from a place of fear, sometimes that can also be related to childhood trauma. If you've grown up in a very chaotic environment, or if you've grown up where there's been a lot of dysfunction, shouting, and you've had to be able to read the room and pick up when shit's about to pop off, then you get really good at being able to pick up the signs. You get really good at being able to be attuned into, okay, someone's mood has shifted, or there's a slight kind of facial expression that changes, and I can kind of pick up when someone's either going to lose their temper or a situation is just going to go left. So usually when you are more of an empath, you can kind of pick up on those shifts, but you don't take it on as, oh, I kind of need to brace myself to prepare to be in this uncomfortable situation. It's more that you're aware of it, whereas when you have more codependent traits, that sensitivity to the shift is almost a bit like a trauma response. Empaths who have more of a healthy way of using those skills, they can kind of feel and notice when those emotional changes are happening, or when there's a shift or a change, but they can do that without losing themselves in the process. And I think the real key difference between the two is when people have experienced more childhood trauma, their ability to pick up emotions are more rooted in that trauma, as opposed to actually being someone who is intuitively empathic. It's almost like that has been a survival strategy for them to actually be able to cope in difficult environments. If you had to manage your parents' emotions, or you weren't allowed to express your emotions in your family of origin, or talking about feelings and emotions just really wasn't either encouraged, or it just wasn't something that you did or ever really acknowledged, and you never really learned how to do that, it's quite likely that you have more codependency patterns. And you might end up mistaking your codependency for empathy because of that. And maybe you overgive a lot in your relationships. You can end up really draining yourself, maybe even draining your resources trying to be there for people, and just repeating that unhealthy relationship cycle where you are the person constantly overgiving and overextending yourself in relationships when it comes to a cost of you. You can end up feeling really burnt out as a result of all the overgiving. You can start to feel resentful, or, which possibly could be even worse, that you just feel invisible and like you're not really seen, and that no one really actually genuinely sees who you are. They mostly see what they can get from you, and then if they don't get anything of value to them, then it feels like you're not just loved and accepted just for being, and just for being who you are. But if you can recognize your codependency for what it is, then you can really start working on building a stronger sense of self, and not relying on the validation and acceptance of others, or trying to make yourself useful in all situations, or, being the fixer, focusing on other people's problems. When you have more of a sense of self, it's focusing more on you, because you are the best relationship you will ever have. If that relationship with you is lacking, so if you are so overly focused on what everybody else is doing, because that's your way of avoiding dealing with what's going on with you, you're probably entering, or you're probably very much in that murky area of being in codependency and not having a very strong sense of self. Being able to work through that and get better at being able to have a stronger sense of self is about working on your boundaries and recognizing your limits, and really paying attention to what your motives are in your relationships. Instead of just doing things automatically, it's becoming more mindful of why we think, feel, behave, react in the way that we do, which is also something that we really work on in therapy. And I hope you can listen to this and come from a place of compassion, and to not have judgment, especially for yourself, but to also not have judgment for others on this as well. But try to be gentle with yourself if you've noticed that there are some uncomfortable feelings and thoughts coming up as a result of just being more aware of certain patterns and behaviours. We have to approach healing from a place of compassion in order for us to actually be able to get through the difficult stuff and heal. So please just try and remember to be gentle with yourself on this, because it's not easy changing a lot of these relational patterns, especially when you've been doing it for 30 something, 40 something years. It's not something that you can just automatically change overnight. So just be kind to yourself, and slow, steady, small steps matter just as much as big changes. So I have 3 journal prompts that I'm going to follow this episode with, and so feel free to go and pause if you don't have your journal or pen and paper to hand, or just bookmark this episode so you can come back to it later if you want to be able to have a safe space to journal. In fact, while we're on that, if you are not in a place that is safe, I would not necessarily recommend that you approach these journal prompts. I mean, you might be fine, but if you are just, in a busy environment, or you're just very conscious about, maybe tapping into something that could feel painful or emotional, to just have an awareness of where you're at, before you do these journal prompts. So the first one is like a self-check on your motivation in relation to your relationships. Here is the prompt. When I help or support someone, am I doing it from genuine choice or from fear of rejection, of losing them? That's a very powerful question to ask yourself. So that's the first prompt. The second prompt is about childhood connection and being able to notice some of those patterns. And so it's a two-parter. So it's two questions. What patterns of caretaking or overgiving did I notice in my family growing up? And the second part is, how might that influence how I act now? And then the third journal prompt is about your awareness of boundaries. And it is, in the past week, where did I say yes when I wanted to say no? And how did it make me feel in my body? And that is more of a trauma-informed approach to boundaries, and boundary awareness is also being able to recognize what some of those cues are in your body if you are feeling uncomfortable, and also recognizing what it looks like in safety. And if you want more support on any of these things, there is a link in the show notes if you want to book a free telephone consultation to see if we're a good fit to work together. But I will also pop in some resources in the show notes as well that are related to boundaries and related to this episode as well. So do go and have a look and see if there is anything in there that might just support you on this journey of healing. And I'm going to leave you there today, and I hope you are well. I hope you have listened to this podcast episode with the softness and the care that is required in order for you to continue on your healing journey and to not come from a place of self-criticism. Okay, see you in the next episode. Bye. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.